The air is thin at 30,000 feet, a razor's edge of deep, cold blue. Below, a sprawling map of gray and white. The capital of the Reich. In the cockpit of a Messerschmitt, the world is reduced to the engine's drone and the crackle of the radio. The pilot squints against the sun. He has seen the enemy before. He expects the bombers, the lumbering B-17s, the flying fortresses. He sees them. A vast geometric horror moving with inexorable purpose. But today, something is profoundly wrong. Glints of silver swarm around the bombers. Not dozens, hundreds. They are not turning back at the edge of the city's defenses. They are staying P-51 Mustangs. Over Berlin, for the men climbing to meet them, the sight is more than an attack. It is a message written in contrails across the winter sky. This was the moment an entire Air Force began to understand the nature of its own end. But a key did exist. It was not forged in a committee room or born from a new strategic doctrine. It was the result of a chance marriage of British engineering and American manufacturing. It was an aircraft called the P-51 Mustang. The Mustang was not initially designed for long-range escort. It was built by North American Aviation in response to a British request for a new fighter. Early versions, powered by an American Allison engine, performed well at low altitudes, but were asthmatic in the thin air where the high-flying bombers operated. The aircraft was promising, but it was not the answer. The solution came when a Rolls-Royce test pilot, observing the Mustang's sleek, laminar flow wing design, suggested fitting it with the same engine that powered the Spitfire, the legendary Merlin. The result was a revelation. The Merlin supercharger allowed the Mustang to breathe, to thrive in the high-altitude battleground. With the new engine, the P-51 was transformed into arguably the finest all-around piston engine, fighter of the Second World War. It was fast, maneuverable, and heavily armed with 6.50 caliber machine guns. But its most decisive characteristic was something else entirely: range, fitted with internal fuel tanks. The Mustang could already outdistance a Spitfire or a P-47, but the addition of external drop tank simple, disposable fuel tanks fitted under the wings gave it legs no one had thought possible. A P-51B, taking off from a muddy field in East Anglia, could now fly all the way to Berlin, engage in combat for 30 minutes, and fly all the way back. The key had been found. With the weapon came a new will. In January 1944, command of the 8th Air Force passed to General James "Jimmy" Doolittle, the man famous for leading the audacious 1942 raid on Tokyo. Doolittle was an aggressive, offensive-minded commander. He looked at the growing fleets of Mustangs and P-47s, now also equipped with drop tanks, and saw not just a shield, but a sword. He rescinded the standing order that tied the escort fighters to the bombers. His new directive was brutally simple. Your first duty is to destroy German fighters. The little friends were unleashed. They were no longer just bodyguards. They were hunters. They flew ahead of the bomber streams, clearing the skies. They dove down on German airfields, strafing fighters as they tried to take off. They sought out the Luftwaffe and forced it into a fight it could not afford to have. This created a fatal dilemma for the Jagdflieger. If they rose to attack the bombers, they would be met by hundreds of American fighters eager for combat. If they stayed on the ground, the bombers would get through, and the factories that built their planes and the refineries that produced their fuel would be systematically turned to rubble. They had to fight, and so they fought. A grim arithmetic began to govern the air war. The United States was training thousands of pilots and producing fighters on an industrial scale Germany could not comprehend. When an American pilot was shot down, a new one, fresh from thousands of hours of training, was ready to take his place in a brand new aircraft. When an experienced German expert, an ace with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of victories, was killed, he was irreplaceable. He was often replaced by a teenager with less than 200 hours in the air. Sent up in a machine that might have been rebuilt from salvaged parts, the Luftwaffe was being bled white. Not in a single decisive battle, but in 1,000 small, vicious dogfights, day after day. The shield of the Reich was cracking. Doolittle and the 8th Air Force Command knew it was time to strike the heart. The target was designated Berlin. Hitting the capital was more than a military objective. It was a psychological blow aimed directly at the Nazi leadership and the German people. It was a statement that Grin's promise was broken, that nowhere was safe. The stage was set for a confrontation that would pit two fundamentally different fighting machines and two opposing philosophies of air power against each other in the skies above the capital. To understand the end, one must remember the beginning. In 1940, the head of the Luftwaffe, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, had made a boast, an arrogant promise to the German people. No enemy bomber would ever reach the capital of the Reich. For a time, his promise held. The Luftwaffe was a force forged in the Spanish Civil War and perfected in the skies over Poland and France. It was an instrument of blitzkrieg, a sharp, tactical weapon designed to shatter armies on the ground. Its pilots were experienced, confident, and flying some of the most advanced aircraft in the world. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Focke-Wulf 190, they were masters of their domain. Then, from the West, a new theory of war arrived. It came from the United States Army Air Forces, specifically the 8th Air Force, gathering in the damp fields of England. Their doctrine was audacious, born of American industrial confidence. They would fly in broad daylight. They would strike with surgical precision at the heart of Germany's war machine ball bearing factories, aircraft plants, submarine pens. They believed they could do this because they had a revolutionary weapon, the B-17 Flying Fortress. It was not just a bomber. It was a concept, a self-defending formation. 10 or more heavy .50 caliber machine guns bristling from every angle. Flown in tight combat boxes, the bombers could theoretically create interlocking fields of fire, a storm of lead no fighter could penetrate. The theory was elegant. The reality was brutal. The Luftwaffe adapted. German pilots, the Jagdflieger, were not intimidated by the walls of tracers. They learned to attack from the one direction the bombers were most vulnerable, head-on, from 12 o'clock high. A closing speed of over 500 miles per hour gave the B-17 gunners a fleeting, 2-second window to score a hit. The German fighters, meanwhile, had a stationary 4-engine target filling their windscreens. A single burst from a 20mm cannon could obliterate a cockpit, kill the pilots, and send 10 men in a 30-ton machine spiraling to their doom. The Luftwaffe developed new weapons, air-to-air rockets fired from outside the bomber's gun range, designed to break up the tight formations. Once a fortress was isolated, it was helpless. Still, the Americans came. But their greatest vulnerability was not firepower. It was fuel. The Allied escorts, the little friends as the bomber crews called them, could only go so far. British Spitfires barely had the range to cross the channel. The American P-47 Thunderbolt, a rugged and powerful fighter, could push deeper. But eventually, inevitably, they would reach their point of no return. A gentle waggle of the wings was the signal. A final, silent goodbye. They would peel away, back towards England, leaving the bomber streams to press on alone. For the bomber crews, this was the moment of supreme dread. The loneliest place on Earth was the cockpit of a B-17, deep inside Germany, with another hour to the target and no friendly fighters in sight. This was when the wolves would gather. Luftwaffe controllers would vector their fighter wings to intercept the now defenseless formations. The attacks were relentless, disciplined, and catastrophic. The autumn of 1943 brought the American theory to its breaking point. A series of missions against the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt culminated in disaster. On October 14th, a day that would be known forever as Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force sent 291 B-17s to strike the city. 60 were shot down. Another 17 were so badly damaged they were scrapped upon return. Nearly 600 airmen were lost. The losses were unsustainable. The daylight bombing campaign was on the verge of collapse. The Luftwaffe had won a major victory, proving that it controlled the skies over the fatherland. The Reich's airspace was a fortress, and the 8th Air Force did not have the key. For the American pilot in the cockpit of a P-51, the world had never been bigger. The mission briefing had been electric. The target was not a factory or a rail yard. The target was an idea. It was Berlin. Flying with the 4th Fighter Group, the legendary Debden Eagles, the pilot was the tip of a very long spear. For hours he had flown east, over Holland, across the plains of northern Germany. He watched the fuel gauge, nursing the precious gasoline from his wing-mounted drop tanks. This was territory no little friend had ever reached before. Below, the bombers were a river of aluminum, their contrails a chalk line drawn across the sky. Then the order came. Drop tanks. With a clunk, the empty cylinders fell away, and the Mustang was clean. It was lighter, faster, a pure fighter once more. Doolittle's directive was etched into his mind: destroy the German fighters. He was not a bodyguard. He was a hunter sent deep into the enemy's preserve. Ahead, he saw them. Black specks climbing out of the haze, clawing for altitude. The Luftwaffe. But the old fear, the dread of being outnumbered, was gone. He looked to his left, his right. He saw hundreds of Mustangs, their silver fuselages catching the sun. They were a wave about to break over the defenders of the Reich. This was not an escort mission. This was an invasion. For the German pilot of Jagdgeschwader 2, the world was shrinking with terrifying speed. The scramble alarm was a familiar violence, but the reports from the ground controllers were not. Einmotoren. Über Berlin. Single-engine fighters over Berlin. It was impossible. A lie. He climbed in his Focke-Wulf 190, the engine protesting in the thin, freezing air. His mission was simple, brutal, and for months, achievable: smash the bombers. He and his comrades were the fire brigade of the Reich, the Reichsverteidigung. They were experts in high-speed, head-on passes. They knew how to break the combat boxes and pick off the stragglers. But as he broke through the cloud layer, the tactical geometry he had mastered became meaningless. He saw the bombers, yes, but he also saw the Mustangs. They were everywhere. Above, below, flanking the stream. They were not tied to the fortresses. They were roaming, aggressive, looking for a fight. He was faced with a suicidal choice. Dive on the bombers and the Mustang would be on his tail in seconds. Turn to engage the Mustang, and the bombers would fly on to rain death upon the capital. For every one of his aircraft, there seemed to be 3 of theirs. These were not the lumbering P-47s he was used to fighting. These were sleek, deadly predators fighting at an altitude where his own aircraft struggled. He was no longer the hunter. He was the prey in the sky above his own home. On the ground, 2 opposing realities unfolded. In a quiet English headquarters, General Jimmy Doolittle stood before a massive map of Europe. He watched as the markers representing his fighter groups moved past the old dreaded line of maximum range. He had made a colossal gamble, betting the lives of his men on a new machine and a new philosophy. He had unleashed his fighters, trusting them to not only protect the bombers, but to actively seek out and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found. Every crackled radio intercept, every report of a successful engagement, was a vindication of that trust. He was breaking the Luftwaffe not by destroying its factories, but by killing its irreplaceable pilots. Miles away, in a bunker near Berlin, The mood was one of disbelief turning to panic. For Reichsmarschall Göring, the reports were a personal and political catastrophe. His promise to the Führer and the German people was being shattered in real time. His commanders were screaming for reinforcements that did not exist. Their entire defensive strategy was built on a single inviolable premise: the enemy's fighters could not reach Berlin. On this day, that premise was proven false. The fortress had been breached. The key had been turned in the lock, and now the door was being kicked in. Inside the vibrating fuselage of a B-17 named Stinky, the world was a metronome of fear. The 10-man crew knew this rhythm well. Hours of cold, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. They had just passed the point on the map where the escorts always turned for home. The interphone was usually quiet here, a tense waiting silence. But today, the silence was broken by the voice of the top turret gunner. His words were flat with disbelief. "They're still with us. The little friends are still with us." Every man who could looked out. There they were. Silver slivers against the deep blue. Mustangs. They were not leaving. As German fighters rose to meet them, a new spectacle unfolded. Instead of forming a defensive circle, the Mustangs went out to greet them, diving and climbing, their tracers reaching out like angry fingers. The bomber, for so long the target, the bait, was now the spectator. The waist gunners, accustomed to the brutal head-on attacks, watched as dogfights erupted miles away, too far for their guns to matter. It was a profound, strategic shift felt in the gut of every man in the formation. They were no longer just a payload to be delivered at any cost. They were being defended by guardians who could follow them into the very heart of hell. Below them, in the streets of Berlin, the wail of the Fliegelalarm was a part of life. Citizens moved with practiced efficiency towards the public shelters and the cellars of their apartment blocks. It was a grim routine. But on this day, those who risked a final glance at the sky saw something new. The contrails were different. It was not the orderly parallel lines of the bomber formations and the dark puffs of flak. The sky was being vandalized by a chaotic web of white streaks, looping, diving, and corkscrewing in impossible patterns. It was the signature of 1,000 individual life or death struggles happening miles above their heads. The distant, high-pitched scream of Merlin engines in a power dive. The faint rattle of machine gun sounds that had never been heard over the capital before. This was not an orderly defense. This was a desperate, sprawling melee. It was visual proof that the shield had been broken. The war was no longer something happening on a distant front, reported in the newspapers. It was happening directly overhead, a violent referendum on the promises of their leaders. The front line had arrived. For the pilots, the strategists, and the civilians, the abstract calculations of war range, fuel, production, morale were now irrelevant. All that mattered was the violent reality unfolding in the cold air above the city. All across the sky, the individual duels and desperate maneuvers began to coalesce into a single, sprawling battle, a turning point being fought at 25,000 feet. As dusk settled over the airfields of East Anglia, the waiting began. On the ground, mechanics and medics stood in the cold, their eyes fixed on the eastern sky. Then, the first specks appeared. The low, guttural drone of 4 Wright Cyclone engines, a sound of survival. One by one, the fortresses and liberators returned. They came back scarred. Some flew on 3 engines, one propeller feathered and still. Others had gaping, fist-sized holes in their wings and fuselages, the aluminum skin peeled back by flak. Red flares arched from the cockpits of the most heavily damaged, a desperate signal for priority landing. A plea for the ambulances waiting at the edge of the runway. The numbers were counted in the quiet of the debriefing rooms, over cups of coffee laced with whiskey. 69 heavy bombers had not returned. 11 fighters were gone. Nearly 800 men were now listed as killed, wounded, or missing in action. It was the highest single-day loss the 8th Air Force had yet suffered in the war. The cost was brutal, the price paid in empty bunks and letters that would have to be written. But beneath the grief and exhaustion was a hard, undeniable truth. They had gone to Berlin, and the little friends had gone with them, all the way there and all the way back. They had broken the fortress. Across the North Sea, a different kind of accounting was taking place. At Luftwaffe stations, the silence was heavier. The empty hardstands belonged to flight leaders and squadron commanders. The losses were not just in machines, but in men who could never be replaced. 75 German fighters were confirmed destroyed, with many more written off after crash landing. More than 60 German pilots were killed or wounded. These were not novices. They were the core of the Reichsverteidigung, the Home Defense Force. They were the experten who had held the line for years. The physical damage to the Erkner factory was significant, but it was a secondary concern. The true damage was psychological, a shock that went to the very top of the German command. General Adolf Galland, the charismatic and respected head of Germany's fighter force, had long warned his superiors that this day would come. He had fought for more fighters, better tactics, and a realistic appraisal of the enemy's industrial strength. Now his worst fears were confirmed. Upon hearing the reports, he would later state the grim reality of the situation with a clarity that cut through all propaganda. "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin," he said, "I knew the jig was up." It was a simple, devastating admission. The presence of those fighters over the capital was not just a tactical problem. It was the refutation of the entire German air defense strategy. It meant there was no longer a safe haven. It meant that every factory, every oil refinery, every city in the Reich was now within reach of the American bombers, and that those bombers would be defended by fighters the Luftwaffe could not consistently defeat. The grim arithmetic of the air war had reached its conclusion. The Americans could absorb their losses. The Luftwaffe could not. On March 6th, the 8th Air Force had traded machines for irreplaceable men. The battle was over, but the war for the sky had fundamentally changed. For the Luftwaffe, it was not just a defeat. It was a verdict. That verdict was not a single event, but the beginning of a sentence. The 8th Air Force returned to Berlin 2 days later. On March 8th, they came back again on the 9th. The impossible had become routine. The psychological shock of the first raid curdled into a grim, attritional reality. For the Luftwaffe, there was no longer a place to hide, to rebuild, to train. The front line was now everywhere. General Doolittle's gamble had been vindicated in the most spectacular fashion. The doctrine of fighter escort was rewritten. The P-51s were no longer just a shield. They were the primary weapon for achieving air supremacy. The new standing order was to hunt. Fighter groups were released to sweep ahead of the bombers, to strafe German airfields, to seek out and destroy the Luftwaffe in the air and on the ground. The American strategy shifted from simply surviving the trip to the target to the systematic annihilation of the enemy's air force. Every mission was now a baited trap, using the bomber streams to force the German fighters into a battle. They could not win. This was the essential prerequisite for what was to come. In the planning rooms for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, the greatest fear was the Luftwaffe. The battles over Berlin in the spring of 1944 were the answer to that fear. By bleeding the Jagdflieger white over their own homeland, the Allies ensured that the skies over the invasion beaches would be theirs alone. The road to D-Day was paved with the wreckage of German fighters shot down hundreds of miles to the east. For the German High Command, the options narrowed to the point of desperation. New tactics were born of this new reality. The Sturmgruppen were formed special squadrons of heavily armored Focke-Wulf 190s, their pilots taking oaths to press their attacks to point-blank range, even to ram the bombers if necessary. It was a strategy of sacrifice, a tacit admission that they could no longer compete in a conventional dogfight. The development of the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter was accelerated. A technological Hail Mary, but even a miracle weapon needs fuel to fly and experienced pilots to fly it. The relentless bombing campaign, now protected by the Mustangs, was systematically destroying Germany's synthetic oil plants. Starving the entire war machine, the change was felt most acutely in the German cockpits. The confident expert of 1943 was a dying breed. By mid-1944, the average German fighter pilot was a teenager with barely 150 hours of flight time. He would take off in a machine that might be low on high-grade fuel, climb to face an enemy that outnumbered him 5 or 10 to 1, and fight against American pilots who had 10 times his training. His life expectancy was measured in a handful of missions. The sky was no longer a realm of chivalrous duels. It was an industrial slaughterhouse. The Battle of March 6th did not end the war, but it marked the point of no return. It was the moment the Luftwaffe, as a strategic force capable of defending the Reich, was broken. It had lost control of its own sky. From that day forward, it would fight a losing, hopeless battle, a long, painful retreat until the final day of the war. The strategic calculations were cold and absolute. But for the men who flew through that fire, the memory of the day was etched not in numbers, but in the stark, personal images of a sky turned upside down. 11:42 a.m., March 6, 1944, over northern Germany, the signal is given. The American fighter groups push their throttles forward. They are the vanguard of Mission 250, an aerial armada of nearly 700 heavy bombers and 800 escort fighters. Their target, the Erkner ball bearing plant on the outskirts of Berlin. But the true target is the Luftwaffe itself. On the ground, German radar operators watch their screens in disbelief. The plot is enormous, far larger than the disastrous Schweinfurt raids. Luftwaffe command vectors its assets with practiced urgency. From airfields across the northwest, the fighter wings, the Jagdgeschwader, scramble into the freezing air. JG-1, JG-11, JG-26, these are the firemen of the Reich, the seasoned veterans tasked with defending the homeland. They climb to their preferred altitude, assembling into disciplined battle formations, or Gefechtsverband. Their flight leaders brief them over the radio. Expect heavy resistance. Execute head-on passes. Break the bomber formations at all costs. Their strategy relies on a crucial weapon, the twin-engine Zersterer, the destroyers. Messerschmitt Bf 110s of ZG-26 and ZG-76, laden with 21 centimeters air-to-air rockets, are vectored to a position where they can fire their devastating salvos into the dense bomber boxes from outside the range of their machine guns. These heavy fighters are the sledgehammers intended to crack the American formations open, allowing the lighter, more agile W-190s and Bf-109s to dart in and finish off the cripples. This plan has worked before. It is their best defense. But today, Doolittle's hunters are waiting for them. Near the Dummer Lake, a marshy landmark used by both sides for navigation. The leading elements of the 4th and 357th Fighter Groups spot the German formations assembling below. The American pilots do not wait. They drop their wing tanks and dive. For the German pilots in the Bf-110s, the attack is a nightmare realized. Their aircraft are powerful, but they are not dogfighters. They are slow to turn, slow to climb. They are utterly defenseless without their own single-engine fighter protection. But that protection is itself under attack. The sky erupts into a swirling chaos of individual combats, what the pilots call a fur ball. The disciplined German assault formations disintegrate before they can even form up. A Bf-110 pilot, lining up a shot on a distant B-17, suddenly sees his wingman explode in a ball of orange flame. He brakes hard, his gunner screaming warnings over the intercom. A P-51 flashes past his canopy, its 6.50 caliber stitching holes across his fuselage. The rockets he carries, his primary weapon, are now just dead weight, dragging him down. His mission is no longer to attack the bombers. It is simply to survive. All across the front of the battle, the same scene repeats. The sledgehammer of the Zersterer force is being systematically dismantled. Within 20 minutes, the Luftwaffe loses dozens of its most powerful bomber killers and, more critically, their experienced two-man crews. The German single-engine fighters are forced to abandon their own attack plans to try and save the helpless heavy fighters. Drawing them into a sprawling high-altitude melee they are outnumbered in. The American bomber crews, flying onward, witness the spectacle with a sense of profound, almost surreal relief. The expected waves of head-on attacks do not materialize. The skies ahead of them, usually thick with German fighters, are instead a canvas of chaotic dogfights. They see German planes falling, trailing smoke. They hear the triumphant calls of their little friends over the radio, calling out kills. The German command structure is in chaos. Flight leaders are screaming for help. Ground controllers are watching their meticulously planned interception fall apart in real time. The first wave of defense has not just been blunted, it has been shattered. And through the wreckage of that defense, the river of bombers continues to flow. An unstoppable current of destruction, now less than 30 minutes from Berlin. 12:11 p.m., the Berlin flak zone. The second wave of German fighters rises to meet them. These are the pilots of JG-3 Udit, scrambled from fields just outside the capital. They are the last line of defense. They expect to find a bomber stream weakened and dispersed by the outer fighter screens. They expect to find American escorts low on fuel, ready to turn for home. Instead, they find the full, unblunted might of the 8th Air Force. For a German pilot climbing towards the bombers, the sight is a tactical impossibility. The sky is not empty. It is saturated with P-51s. They are orbiting in layers, a high cover and a close escort waiting for him. The carefully planned, massed head-on attack is no longer an option. There is no time to form up, no space to maneuver. The moment his squadron appears, it is swarmed from all sides, through the plexiglass of a Mustang cockpit, a sight few had ever imagined seeing. The Havel River, a silver ribbon. The dark rectangle of the Tiergarten. And then the city itself. The American pilots are fighting over the enemy's capital, a symbol of absolute air superiority. They are imbued with a chilling confidence. They dive on the Bf-109s and FW-190s with a ferocity born of vengeance for the bloody skies of 1943. A German expert, a veteran of 100 missions, finds himself in a fight for his life against a 22-year-old from Ohio. His Focke-Wulf is a good machine, but it is just one machine. He cannot engage one Mustang without two others appearing on his tail. He sees his wingman, a boy of 19, get hit. The 109 doesn't explode. It simply flies apart, its pieces tumbling down toward the city it was meant to protect. The German pilot is no longer defending the Reich. He is defending a single coordinate on a map. A coordinate that is already burning for the bomber crews. The final run to the target is an entry into a new kind of hell. The sky ahead turns black, not with clouds, but with the greasy dark smudges of heavy flak. 88mm and 105mm shells fired from the massive flat towers of the Berlin defenses. A sky full of invisible tearing metal. The B-17s cannot evade. They must fly straight and level. The entire aircraft shudders as shells burst nearby, the percussive hump audible even over the roar of the engines. Shrapnel, hot and jagged, rips through aluminum skin. It is a lottery of physics and altitude. Inside the lead bomber, the bombardier lies on his stomach, his eye pressed to the rubber cup of his instrument. He ignores the chaos outside. He ignores the wounded waist gunner and the frantic calls on the interphone. His world is the Norden bomb site, the two thin crosshairs he must align over the factory below. His gloved fingers make minute adjustments. The aircraft is now flying itself, slave to his commands. The bomb bay doors are open, the cold wind a physical presence. Bombs away. The words are almost a whisper on the interphone. The fortress gives a slight lurch upwards as 2,500-pound bombs are released from their shackles. One by one, the bombardiers in the following aircraft toggle their own releases, adding their payload to the growing cascade of high explosives. The mission is accomplished. The great silver formations begin a slow, ponderous turn to the west, towards home. But the fight is not over. It becomes a running, 300-mile battle back to the coast. The surviving German fighters, low on fuel and ammunition, make desperate, often solitary passes. They are harried and pursued relentlessly by the Mustangs, who seem to have endless reserves of fuel and aggression. By the time the last bombers cross the Dutch coast, the scale of the day's events begins to settle. The Americans have lost 69 bombers and 11 fighters. It is a heavy price, but the Luftwaffe has lost 75 fighters in the air and more on the ground. The numbers, however, do not tell the story. The losses for the 8th Air Force are replaceable. The losses for the Luftwaffe, the veteran flight leaders, the irreplaceable Experten. The last of their trained pilots are not. The numbers would be tallied later, the reports filed, the medals awarded. But for the men of the Luftwaffe climbing out of their cockpits on the evening of March 6th, the numbers were irrelevant. They had seen the future, and it was a sky filled with enemy fighters from which there was no escape. A sky turned upside down is a matter of perspective. For the American airmen, it was the moment the horizon expanded to infinity. For the German pilot, it was the moment the ceiling came crashing down. The machine at the center of this inversion was not a weapon of ideology, but of engineering and logistics. The P-51 Mustang, a British engine married to an American airframe, was a signature of industrial might, a testament to a global war fought with global resources. It was a simple, mechanical solution to a complex strategic problem: distance. And by solving it, it unraveled the entire defensive fabric of the Third Reich. The battle over Berlin on March 6, 1944, was more than a raid. It was a dress rehearsal for the invasion of Europe. The war for the sky had to be won before the war on the ground could begin. The thousands of ships gathering for D-Day could only cross the channel if the Luftwaffe was incapable of rising to meet them. That capability was systematically dismantled, pilot by pilot, in the freezing air high above Germany. The sacrifice of the bomber crews in 1943 had been the bait. The arrival of the long-range Mustang in 1944 was the springing of the trap. War is often measured in territory gained, in cities captured. But here, the decisive ground was the air itself. It was a battle for control of a three-dimensional battlespace, and its outcome dictated the fate of millions below. For the men of the Luftwaffe, it was the final, bitter lesson that courage and skill could not overcome the cold equations of mass production. For the Allies, it was the ultimate vindication of a brutal, costly, and revolutionary theory of warfare. The contrails that scarred the sky over Berlin that day eventually faded. The smoke cleared, but the message they delivered was indelible. It was written in the wreckage of fallen aircraft and in the minds of the men who survived. It spoke of a promise broken, a fortress breached, and an inevitable end that was no longer a distant possibility, but a certainty, descending from the stratosphere at 400 miles per hour.